Good evening, everybody. Good evening. Welcome, everyone, to the Brussels City Hall this evening for this talk. We're extremely honoured to introduce Howard French to give a lecture here this evening. This talk is the first in a prestigious lecture series by the VUB on the current state of the world, where great contemporary thinkers and academic experts have been invited to shed light on the global society and economic shift taking place. Through debates, discussions and Q&As, they will comment on the existential challenges of our time and suggest possible solutions. I'm here just to give a brief outline to the evening's run and also to introduce our speakers tonight. So to let you know that tonight we will be really proud to announce the Brussels Mayor, Philippe Close, who will give an introduction to the evening. This will be followed by our lecture by Howard French. And after this, we will have an interview between Jonathan Holslag, who has invited Howard French here, followed by a Q&A from the public. So we invite your questions for that. And we'll close the evening with remarks by Pascal Schmidt. And that will be followed by a reception in this room here, which you're all invited to. So for now, I will just hand over to the Mayor of the City of Brussels, Philippe Close. And quickly, I must invite you to check that your mobile phones have been switched off for the evening so that we have no unwelcome intrusions. Thank you very much for being here, and I invite Philippe Close to introduce us. Thank you.
Thank you. Dear Secretary of State, dear Pascal, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Gothic Hall of the Brussels City Hall, where we are honored to welcome this evening Mr. Howard French, the guest of the VUB, and the moderator professor, the second time that you come here in the City Hall, Jonathan Holslag. Howard French has been a university professor in Côte d'Ivoire, a journalist from the New York Times, where he headed the Tokyo bureau, a photographer of old Shanghai, and the author of numerous books that look at the world today through the prism of the relations between China and the African continent. This polyglot has also been a press correspondent in Central America and in many African states, making him a true citizen of the world. His understanding of our world is therefore informed by invaluable experiences, which is well outlined in a moment. Today's history is deeply rooted in the past. It is important to untangle them in order to free ourselves from the burdens that paralyze and to preserve the fruitful legacies. As far as the painful colonial history of Africa is concerned, also Belgium has written too many dark pages that we are revisiting today so that our common memory, reconciled, can forge a future of cooperation. This is all the more important as Brussels is now a cosmopolitan city, second only to Dubai, with many Afro-descendants, particularly from the Democratic Republic of Congo. The diversity of Brussels is an advantage, since what we want to do together is more important than where we come from. Symbolically, the Patrice Lumumba Square, inaugurated 4 years ago, inscribed the independence of the Congo in Brussels public space as a liberation of the Congolese people. The same Lumumba confided these words in his last letter to his wife. His story will one day speak, but it will not be the history that is told in Brussels, Washington, Paris, or the United Nations. Howard French intends to tell us a decentralized story of a continent which faces the major challenges of this century: climate change, access to resources, education, urbanism, migration, sustainable development. The colonial period brutally destroyed African societies, in particular their economy, imposing even foods that today seems to be traditional. The rice used in West African cuisine, for example, was imported cheaply from Asia, more than a century ago in order to free up agricultural land for food production for the metropoles, creating a country which is today very dependent on world market prices to ensure its food supply. But Africa still provides us with lessons of wisdom, provided we know how to listen. I think of the remarkable speech of the Kenyan ambassador to United Nations, Martin Kimani, condemning the invasion of Ukraine, recalling that the borders between African states had been drawn arbitrarily by the colonial powers without taking into account ethnic or economic continuities. He recommended not to, and I quote, look back and sink into a dangerous form of nostalgia. And Mr. Kimani added, we are not satisfied with our borders. We simply aim higher, bigger than the map. We aim for peace. International rules accepted by all states was the aim of the Great Solution, the Magnifica Charta, published in 1915 in the United States by the Belgian Nobel Peace Prize winner Henri Lafontaine, professor in our university, who advocated the use of law to prevent and resolve conflicts, an ambition that is as unsatisfied as it is urgent. I conclude with an anecdote that underlines Brussels' ancient vocation for encounters, exchanges, and the recognition of otherness. Around 1536, the Bey of Tunis, Moulay Hassan, stayed in Brussels for some time with Charles V. A portrait of him with a nobleman from the Tazis family dressed à la Turque, as it was called in those days, remains. The chroniclers observe that wearing the clothes of a Muslim guest was an exotic mark of aristocratic distinction. The other teaches us about who we are. In telling the story of Africa, our French will also speak about us this evening. I thank him warmly for his presence, and I wish you an excellent conference. I thank you.
Thank you, Mayor Philippe Close, for the introduction. At the risk of repeating some of your words, I would like to now introduce Howard French, who we are so happy to have speak here today. Howard French is professor at Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism. He has been since 2008, and he's been twice nominated for the Pulitzer Prize. Prior to that, for over 2 decades, he was a senior writer and foreign correspondent for the New York Times. He is a frequent contributor to the New York Review of Books, a contributor to The Guardian Long Read, and a global affairs columnist at Foreign Policy. He was the New York Times bureau chief in the Caribbean and Central America, West and Central Africa, Tokyo and Shanghai. Howard French is the author of several books, including most recently, and the subject of the lecture tonight, in 2021, Born in Blackness, Africa, Africans, and the Making of the Modern World, 1471 to the Second World War. In this book, he brilliantly argues the case for the recognition of Africa's immense contribution to modernity. And this was selected as one of the best books of the year by the Financial Times. And as I mentioned earlier, this lecture will be followed by a Q&A with Howard French, moderated by the VUB Professor of International Politics, Jonathan Holslag. So I welcome Howard French to the table, or the lectern as you prefer. Thank you.
Take it that I'm supposed to hold the microphone. Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for coming to this talk. It's a pleasure and an honor to be with you, to be in Brussels, to be in the town hall, and to be in Europe at this moment, and particularly to be in Belgium at a time when your country is in the midst of a process of wrestling with and perhaps reinterpreting some of its recent past. I speak on the eve of, as I understand it, a visit by your king to the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Is this loud enough?
I would just,
You You want me to hold two of them?
Or just try this one.
Okay. Tell me if it's better. I have someone in the back who's, if you hold your ear like this, I know I'm not speaking loud enough. Okay. No, okay, good. So I know that your king is about to visit the Democratic Republic of Congo. I did not, as far as my own planning was concerned, this is a coincidence, but I also consider that to make this a particularly opportune moment for a visit like mine with you today. I spent the better part of 5 years covering West and Central Africa and for the New York Times in the 1990s. And during that period, I spent an enormous amount of time in the country that was then called Zaire and witnessed the fall of Mobutu Sese Seko and his replacement by the Kabila government late in the 1990s. I have not come to talk to you about that history, though, today. I've come to talk to you about the history that's contained in my book, and it is quite a voluminous history, a history of 500 or, if you will, even 600 years. And the purpose of my book really is to place Africa at the center of the story of world history in the modern era, and to do something even more particular than that, which is not a small challenge. To place Africa at the foundation of the creation of this thing that we often call the West. This may sound paradoxical to you. I am here to tell you that without Africa, there would be no West, that it was Africa and Africans that were the main drivers of the creation of the West. And so I'm going to have to go back to the beginning, meaning toward the late medieval period, to begin to trace this narrative arc, to explain to you how I came to this conclusion, and hopefully to persuade you to think anew about the topic of Africa and its place in your lives, its place in my life. I'm a Westerner as much as you are. So what do I mean by the West? First of all, we should define it. This word gets used quite a bit without anyone ever really pausing to dissect it or to consider its true meaning. In the context of this talk, I mean an economic condominium which comes to be formed between the Atlantic-facing parts of Europe and the so-called New World. That it is the joint prosperity created by these two parts of the world, and to a certain extent their political union on top of an economic union, that we think of when we use this code language of the West. And so to explain to you how I've come to this view, I have to go back several centuries to talk about the beginning of the modern era. I don't know how people are taught in elementary school or junior high school or beyond in Belgium or widely in Europe, but I'm going to assume that they are taught in ways that are not so different from the way we as Americans are taught. And therefore that there are two stories that are at the center of your narratives of how the modern age begins. Depending on who you listen to, one of these two narratives may be given more prominence than the other, but they're always present in the traditional, conventional accounts of the modern era. One of them is the narrative of Christopher Columbus and his quote-unquote discovery of the New World. For many people in conventional accounts of history, this is the proximate start of the modern age, with the discovery of the New World by Christopher Columbus. The other of these events is a bit more protracted and diffuse, but also quite remarkable, or given a very remarkable place in the narrative, in the conventional narrative of the start of the modern age. And that is the great voyages of exploration by Europeans, and especially by Iberians, that led to Asia, that led people to navigate around the Cape of Good Hope in southern Africa and to arrive in Calicut in India like Vasco da Gama did, and then to go on from there to places like China and Japan. These are the two signal events that are used in most typical, most conventional accounts of how the modern age begins, right around the year 1500. that all of the continents become stitched together for the first time in history in lasting and permanent ways at high speeds. High speeds for that era didn't mean the internet. High speeds in that era meant being able to travel long distances by sea and to be able to arrive reliably sure of reaching one's destination. In the telling of both of these narratives, the place of Africa is completely erased. It is completely elided, to use a slightly more elegant expression. Africa is cut out of the picture, and I'm going to tell you how Africa is cut out of the picture, and then I'm going to tell you why it is so wrong that Africa has been cut out of the picture. The story, the conventional story in these two narratives presents Africa as a geographic, let me go back, let me pause. Sometimes these narratives don't even mention Africa, but when Africa is, when Africa is mentioned in those narratives which do mention Africa, it is presented merely as a geographic obstacle, as a space or as a continent that has to be circumnavigated in order for Europeans to reach their true destination, in order to reach the parts of the world that were truly interesting to Europe, the parts of the world that really mattered for Europeans. This way of telling the story is the beginning of a narrative tradition that is still with us today. When we think about the parts of the world that matter, Africa is habitually, almost reflexively, put, if it is included in our thinking at all, it is put at the bottom of the list. Now, I said I would tell you why this is wrong, and I think I can demonstrate. I think the facts are very clear of why this is wrong, because if one explores the archives of the Portuguese in the 15th century, beginning in the 1530s, it becomes very obvious that the Portuguese spent 6 or 7 decades with a singular focus, not on reaching Asia, which is the traditional narrative's version of how the modern era begins, but of connecting with Africa. The Portuguese had as a single obsessive focus connecting with Africa. And under the Aviz dynasty, and particularly the leadership of a prince named Henry the Navigator, they begin to mount a series of voyages down the coast of Africa, which takes them decades. They have to overcome their own superstitions about the ocean and about the shape of the world. They have to overcome their own technological limitations in terms of the nature and design of their sailing ships, and they have to overcome financial limitations in the case of the Aviz dynasty, which was a fairly young European dynasty and a very weak one, financially speaking. The Portuguese set out on this mission not to discover a maritime route to Asia, which is the conventional narrative, but to connect with Africa, because in a previous century, meaning beginning in the first quarter of the 14th century, in the year 1324, a sovereign from the Empire of Mali named Mansa Musa traveled 3,500 miles across the Sahara Desert in pilgrimage to reach Cairo and Mecca. Mansa Musa carried with him in an enormous caravan 18 tons of gold. And Mansa Musa in this pilgrimage, most likely the largest amount of gold ever displayed under the control of an individual that we know of in the entire history of the world. Mansa Musa begins to distribute this 18 tons of gold in acts of patronage and religious devotion in Cairo and in Mecca, to the point where he exhausts the entire 18 tons of gold. He distributes as gifts 18 tons of pure gold during his stay in Cairo and in Mecca. This sets off, figuratively speaking, a bomb in the minds of the people of the Mediterranean world. First of all, it depresses the price of gold in Mediterranean markets for at least a decade, to the point where the normal ratios that we see, historically speaking, between the value of silver and gold is reversed. Most of the time, in most places in history, silver has been worth a fraction of the value of gold. Because Mansa Musa distributed so much gold so suddenly in the Eastern Mediterranean, the value of gold plummeted and remained depressed for at least a decade. Silver becomes more valuable than gold. This sends word of the enormous wealth of an African kingdom into Europe, and particularly into Italy and into Iberia. And on the island of Majorca, a school of map making is born of these events and begins making a series of increasingly detailed, initially very speculative, but increasingly detailed and realistic maps of the world, one of whose main purposes was to discover or to locate the source of the Mali Empire. This was the fixation. Mansa Musa arrives in 1325 in Cairo and in Mecca, and by late in the century, you begin to see, in the 14th century, you begin to see the first realistic European maps of the world, including the most famous map of all from this era, a portion of which exists on the cover of my book, called the Catalan Atlas. And it depicts, in the center of its panel, its African panel, a black sovereign sitting on a solid gold throne, carrying a golden scepter in one hand and a golden orb in the other hand, receiving visitors from the north who are coming from the world of North Africa, Tuaregs and Bedouins, who are coming to trade in gold with the Malian leader. And so our story picks up in the next century, in the early 15th century, meaning in the 1420s, 30s, and 40s, with the determination by the Avis to put Africa at the center of their, let's call it, this is a modern term, but let's use it in this anachronistic way, the center of their foreign policy. The Portuguese did not have ports on the Mediterranean Sea. The Portuguese, like most of the rest of Europe, had been cut off from the Silk Road trade by the rise of the Ottoman Empire. And so the Portuguese, not having even a window onto the Mediterranean, quite naturally began to see the Atlantic as the key to their economic and foreign policies. And under Henry the Navigator, the Portuguese begin to place in the 1830s this notion of investing in a long-term effort to discover the sources of African gold known to exist and symbolized or captured in this map, the Catalan Atlas, that they make this their main focus in terms of expansion and ascension in European affairs. And so over a series of decades, the Portuguese gradually make their way down West Africa, around the big bulge of West Africa where you find Mauritania and Senegal, and finally Guinea-Bissau and Guinea. This is a persistent, slow process where only by 1471 do they arrive, after having considered abandoning this effort a few times because the yield in gold had been so small up until this point. In 1471, they have what we Americans might call a eureka moment, where, alas, they discover at a place on the coast of the country that we now know as Ghana, gold is so abundant that even ordinary people, even peasants, wear gold jewelry. And so when the Portuguese see this in Ghana, in coastal Ghana, they know they have arrived at a place that must be the locus of enormous wealth in gold. It doesn't turn out to be the same gold that Mansa Musa had in Mali, but that doesn't matter. It's abundant gold, super abundant gold. The Portuguese, over the next several years, with the agreement of the local authorities of a small kingdom in the west of present-day Ghana, they construct the first European outpost in the tropics. The first fort that Europeans ever built in the tropical world was not in Asia, was not in the Americas, it was in Ghana, at a place called Elmina. And they established there, with the kingdom of that locality in Elmina, an extraordinarily lucrative trade in gold, which was their purpose all along. The amount of gold that the Portuguese begin to acquire peacefully, the Portuguese did not conquer the people of Ghana. They didn't have the means, in fact, to conquer the people of Ghana. The gold that they begin to acquire in trade with the people of Ghana was so abundant that the Portuguese named their treasury, their very treasury. Today, I walked past a museum here in Brussels called Le Musée Royal de la Monnaie. The Portuguese named their treasury the Casa da Guiné in Portuguese, which means the House of Guinea. Guinea was the generic word that the Portuguese used for all of Black Africa in this period. The very treasury of Portugal was called the place of Africa. The Portuguese, within 5 years of the discovery of gold in Elmina, were sourcing between a sixth and a third of the entire national income of Portugal within 5 years of this discovery was derived from trade with Elmina. This sets off incredible, historic, epical events that have changed everything and far, far dwarf the narratives, the conventional narratives of Columbus and of da Gama and of people like that we are mostly all familiar with. And I'm going to spend a few moments to tell you what I mean by this. The Portuguese, in discovering gold in Ghana, not only for the first time in their history put themselves in a position to acquire great wealth. Portugal, I said earlier, the Aviz kingdom earlier, I told you, had been, relatively speaking in the European context, quite a poor kingdom. Now they're a rich kingdom. The Portuguese discover great amounts of gold in Elmina, and they have a primitive notion based on the geographic and geological science of this era that because gold was found in great abundance at that latitude, Ghana is located about 5 degrees north of the equator, then this must mean that gold is distributed according to latitudes in the world. And so the Portuguese determined to continue exploring for gold at similar latitudes. And within 5 degrees or so north of the equator and 5 degrees or so south of the equator, beginning in Africa, this becomes the Portuguese obsession. First of all, they've discovered enormous gold in Elmina, as I've said, and now they are not racing on to Asia, which is the myth history that we have. They are staying put in Africa, trying to discover more gold and other types of commerce that they can engage in other parts of Africa, which they believed to be the most important part of the world outside of Europe by far. This does two things, and it's difficult to tell you, to decide which is the best sequence for telling you this. Let's start with Spain. The first thing this does is it gets Spain's attention. I'm calling it Spain. Spain didn't exist yet. It was Castile. There were other smaller kingdoms in the land that we now know of as Spain, but it gets the attention, let's for simplicity's sake call it Spain, it gets the attention of the Spanish, who had never wished to see Portugal exist as an independent kingdom. Now Portugal is suddenly rich, it has the means to defend itself, it's sending ships all over the world, and the Spanish say to themselves, if the Portuguese find gold in the tropics between 5 degrees north and 5 degrees south of the equator, we should be sending ships to the tropics to look for gold as well. This is the reason that the Spanish crown finances the voyages of Christopher Columbus. Christopher Columbus had spoken to Los Reyes Católicos before this, and they had refused him. Christopher Columbus had spoken to financiers in Italy, and they had refused him. Christopher Columbus's brother had traveled to England and had talked to the King of England looking for financing for these voyages, and they had all refused him. It was when the Portuguese discovered gold in Elmina in vast quantities that the Spanish reconsidered out of the feeling that if they didn't do like the Portuguese were doing, the Spanish would lose everything and the Portuguese would own all of the wealth in the world. This is why Christopher Columbus's voyages were financed by Spain. The Catholic rulers, the Catholic sovereigns of Spain, I do not believe were particularly interested in Christopher Columbus's story about finding a route to Japan and China by going west. They sort of thought that was foolishness. They didn't really care about that. They said, here, we'll give you the money to have 3 ships, go west, navigate your way through the tropics, and see if you can find gold. And you will see, if you look at Christopher Columbus's letters back to the Crown, from the beginning of his first voyage, every letter talks about efforts to find gold. That is the single-minded focus of his voyages. So the other thing that happens, as the Portuguese are lingering in Africa and not racing off to Asia, as the myth history would tell us, the Portuguese discover at a similar latitude, closer to the equator than Ghana, almost, in fact, exactly on the equator, they discover an island called, which they named Sao Tome, St. Thomas, off of the coast of Central Africa. And Sao Tome was an uninhabited island, again, equatorial, volcanic, meaning really rich soils, and Sao Tome being an equatorial island in the tropics, naturally has very strong seasonal rains. So mountainous, rich soil, seasonal rain. This gave some unknown Portuguese, member of these early voyages, the idea that the Portuguese should experiment with planting sugar on this island, because the Portuguese only a decade or 2 before this had begun planting sugar in further parts of the north parts of the Atlantic, like Madeira, and making vast amounts of money in planting sugar in Madeira. Madeira's climate and soil are not actually great for sugar. When they planted sugar in Sao Tome for the first time, they saw sugar take off like crazy. They couldn't believe how productive the soil was or how fast sugar grew in the soils of this tropical volcanic island. There was only one problem. The problem is that sugar, everywhere that it has been grown in world history, I'm talking about sugar cane, everywhere, sugar originates in probably New Guinea or Indonesia, that region of Asia, and has been grown for thousands of years. But if you look wherever sugar has been grown, including New Guinea and Indonesia, across history, it has always been associated with forced labor or with slavery. And the reason for that is that sugar must be planted very densely in order for it to be economically profitable, that the soil has to be heavily irrigated, and it has to be very fertile. And to remain very fertile, it has to be constantly fertilized with manure, with animal excrement. Sugar, the last feature of the sugar cane is that its leaves, so it's packed very densely in a plantation, its leaves are very sharp. And so in order to work a sugar farm, you have to spend time in very tightly planted rows of this crop in the mud, in tropical environments where disease-bearing insects, especially mosquitoes, thrive, and where people are liable to die from malaria, from yellow fever, and from many other kinds of maladies, right? And you're getting cut constantly by contact with the very sharp leaves of this plant. And so throughout history, we have seen no one is willing to grow sugarcane voluntarily. It has to be through the recruitment or subjugation of people into forced labor and slavery. And so the Portuguese themselves begin to undertake this scheme in Sao Tome. And they invent the most, I believe, important economic arrangement, or maybe even we could say institution, in the modern era until the Industrial Revolution. And that institution that they invent there on Sao Tome is the plantation. I invite you to think of plantation using somewhat different terminology. I have, in my lectures about my book, I have preferred the term prison industrial labor camp, because to grow sugar in a plantation environment, which was perfected in Sao Tome, plantations did not exist in Europe before this. Europeans did not have plantation agriculture before this. To master enslaved people for the production of a commodity like sugar in a place like Sao Tome required almost military-style operations. Not only where you needed to capture people and to subdue them, but to constantly supervise them, to police them, and to punish them corporeally. And so I use plantation for an American almost sounds elegant. I don't know how it sounds to the ears of a European audience, but for an American, it's gone with the wind. You see a beautiful house, you see this nice country culture with, you know, ladies dressed up in flowing gowns and things like this. A plantation is a prison industrial labor camp. And this institution is invented and is perfected in Sao Tome, and with extraordinary results for tiny Portugal. So this begins in Sao Tome in the 1510s and 1520s, and by 1530, Sao Tome is making more money from sugar Portugal is making more money from sugar than it had made from gold in Elmina. I've already told you how much money it made from gold in Elmina. As much as a third of all of the crown's receipts came from Elmina. By the 1520s or 30s, sugar was making so much money that for Portugal that it was more valuable than that. An accident of history then occurs. There are lots of accidents of history involved in this story, but the Portuguese, as they were navigating, not rushing yet to Asia, the Portuguese arrive in Elmina, remember, in 1471. They don't really get to Asia until 1500, 1501. They're not even trying to get to Asia. They're completely bound up in their work in Africa because it is so lucrative for them. There's a geographical, navigational, historic accident which takes place as the Portuguese are trying to keep exploring other parts of Africa and seeking sources of wealth on the African continent. I'm skipping a chapter here that's developed at great length in my book. They discover the Kingdom of Congo, and they establish political and economic relations of great importance with the Kingdom of Congo. The Kingdom of Congo sends the children of their elite to school in Portugal. They exchange ambassadors with Portugal. The Kingdom of Congo has a bishop ordained by the Vatican, who today you can find buried. He is buried in the walls of the Vatican. His name is there from 1510. That is how thick the political, economic relations were between Africa and Europe in this time. Anyway, back to Sao Tome. A geographical accident takes place. The Portuguese are trying to be more efficient in the way that they sail to explore Africa, and they master a new navigational technique. I don't know if this word, because it's a technical term, will be familiar to you, but sailors call it, I'm blanking on the term here, where you navigate, it's a zigzag, but that's not the word for it. It'll come to me. Anyway, thank you, Jonathan. You head west, and then it's called tacking. The term in sailing in English is to tack, T-A-C-K. And so it doesn't look logical. You sail west if you want to get to east, and then you cut a sharp leg on a triangle back east, and you can get much faster down the coast of a continent like Africa than you can by hugging the coast. And when the Portuguese begin to do this, they're making bigger and bigger navigational triangles as they're trying to explore new parts of Africa. And accidentally, they collide when they're heading west with the continent of South America and discover the land we know of as Brazil. They were not looking for Brazil. They were looking for other places in Africa, and they bump into Brazil. And this is how Portugal came into possession of the largest country in South America, what would become the largest country in South America. And this happens at the beginning of the 16th century. And by that time, the sugar in Sao Tome, as I've told you, is much more valuable even than the gold in Elmina. And the prison industrial labor camp system, or plantation, then transits the Atlantic, is established very quickly in Brazil by the Portuguese. By 1570s, initially for the first decades, the Portuguese tried to subdue the native populations of Brazil and put them to work in these prison industrial labor settings. but for reasons of medicine and epidemiology, the native populations had no resistance to European diseases, and they died in huge numbers. And so by the middle of the 16th century, the Europeans, the Portuguese, begin to bring Africans across the Atlantic in great numbers for the first time. And by 1570, Portuguese cultivation of sugar in Brazil is taking place on a vast land surface area in Brazil and conducted entirely by people brought from Africa. By the end of that century, meaning within 30 years of African labor in Brazil, the amount of wealth being created for Portugal in Brazil is greater than the amount of wealth being derived by Spain from the most famous stories of wealth acquisition of this era among Europeans. So the most famous stories are of the Spanish conquistadors. Small numbers of these incredibly brave men, we are told, ride on horseback into the highlands of the Inca Empire or into Mexico, or the Aztec Empire, and because they're Europeans and we presuppose a kind of European superiority that seems natural to us at every moment in time, the few numbers of these men are able to conquer vast empires and then acquire control over enormous amounts of gold and silver, according to which place we're talking about. The Portuguese earn more profit in sugar through the prison industrial labor camp system, a story that is not famous in Europe, a story that is not famous in the West. We don't talk about this. We talk about the conquistadors because it's sexy, because it flatters us. But the Portuguese are making more money already by 1600 in sugar through prison industrial labor camp processes. In 1630, the English, latecomers to this game, then established a copycat system of the prison industrial camp system in Barbados, an island which they entered in 1630. They discovered no one there. It was uninhabited like Sao Tome. It's not volcanic, but it is also tropical with very rich soil. And the English get into the business of sugar plantations, prison industrial labor camp systems, chattel slavery, which means a racial form of slavery in which human beings are treated like cattle. That's where the root of chattel comes from. By the way, chattel and cattle are the same Latin root as the word capital. They are all the same word in Latin. Cattle, capital, chattel, human beings. Measurement of wealth. 1630, the English begin sugar production in Barbados. England was not a powerful country in Europe yet. England was not even beginning to be an imperial country yet. This is the start of empire for Britain. It does for England what Elmina and Sao Tome did for Portugal. It begins to make England a rich country. England now has the means, by this incredible wealth creation through enslavement of Africans and chattel slavery and the prison industrial labor camp system, to acquire a large fleet. England gets the means to, for the first time, England didn't dare face off against Spain prior to this. England attacks the Spanish garrisons in Jamaica. Jamaica had been a Spanish island. England, now feeling rich and powerful because of sugar wealth, takes on the Spanish in Jamaica and defeats them, takes over Jamaica. Jamaica is a much bigger island than Barbados. And by the end of the 17th century, the beginning of the 18th century, we see the beginning of Great Britain. Britain now is a great country. Britain becomes a great country on the backs of the prison industrial labor camp system. By the end of the 1700s, Britain, it's still England, formally speaking, England has, like Portugal itself, made more money from the exploitation of Africans in the production of agricultural commodities, first sugar, but also coffee, cocoa, and various other things, than the Spanish acquired in the most famous stories we know of this era, the conquistadors. The Portuguese made more money in enslavement. Now the English have made more money in enslavement. I have to pause before continuing the story in my hemisphere to talk to you about what this did in Europe. So in 1630, The English take over Barbados. They begin, as I said, to produce sugar. Sugar is an extraordinarily rare, refined sugar is an extraordinarily rare and expensive thing in Europe yet. It's not a commodity. It's a luxury good. It's only consumed at that time by royalty and the wealthiest people in Europe. In the space of less than 100 years, because of enslavement, because of the prison industrial labor camp system, sugar becomes a mass commodity. It changes everything about European society. I could spend a whole afternoon telling you the many things that it changed about European society. We don't have time for that. So I'm going to focus on one thing. In 1650, in the town of Oxford in England, some entrepreneur got the idea to open the world's first known coffee shop. Coffee was a product of the prison industrial labor camp system. Coffee was a product of chattel slavery. Coffee becomes palatable to European tastes because of sugar. And so some entrepreneur opens a coffee shop in Oxford, and as all of you know, every time I arrive in a European airport, the thing I'm most impressed with initially is the proliferation of signs for coffee and of coffee shops, and in Northern Europe especially, chocolate. Coffee, chocolate, sugar, these all take me back to this history. So some entrepreneur opens up a coffee shop in Oxford, the first one in the world, and this spreads immediately throughout England, especially to London. And within a decade, there are coffee shops all over London. And then the second entrepreneurial leap is taken. Some clever fellow, or perhaps woman, sees that there are people sitting around in coffee shops having sober, information-laden conversations about the affairs of the day. This had never happened in Europe before. People gathered in Europe up until that time for conversation only around alcohol. In England, it was around ale. And people drank ale not only because they liked alcohol, but because drinking water was not safe. And if you brew alcohol, the alcohol might give you a hangover the next day, but it won't give you diarrhea. And it won't kill you from dysentery, right? And so some clever person sees this new thing called the coffee shop and the culture, which we can see 2 minutes from where we sit now. People sitting in coffee shops, the kinds of things that happen in coffee shops, drinking sweetened coffee and smoking tobacco, another slave product. Their minds stimulated, having lengthy conversations about the affairs of the day. And some entrepreneur says, I bet you there's money to be made in selling them a sheet of printed paper that has the news in it about what happened in Parliament today, what ships arrived from Le Havre, and what's happening with the King of France. This is the birth of the newspaper. The first newspapers in the world grow out of these experiences. And this becomes, with the birth of the newspaper and the coffee shop and these kinds of conversations about the affairs of the day, the birth of a new, and let's use the word, modern idea of what it means to be a citizen of a country. No longer can a king or can an aristocratic elite presume to keep the affairs of the day or of the state private to themselves. Now it becomes the birthright of a citizen to be informed about the news of the day and to have the right to publicly discuss the news of the day. This is an enormous change in European society. This is the proximate birth of democracy as a living thing in European society. This is the birth of the thing that the philosopher Jürgen Habermas calls the public sphere. All of this grows out of the prison industrial labor camp system and chattel slavery and the commodity revolution that takes place at the price of millions of African lives, people extracted from Africa and put to work for the purposes of wealth creation and of commodity supply in Europe and subsequently in what we defined as the West in the beginning of this talk. So back to the Caribbean. We have seen sugar begins in Sao Tome, it crosses the Atlantic to Brazil, it goes to to Barbados, then the English capture Jamaica, they take it to Jamaica. France gets into the business even later than England does. It begins to plant sugar in Martinique and Guadeloupe in the southeastern Caribbean. Let me just give you an idea of how fantastic the amounts of wealth that were created in places like Martinique or in Barbados. Barbados, for those of you who know the geography of my country, I wish I had prepared a European example. It would have been more easy for you. Barbados is smaller than, it's 1/3 the size of the city of Los Angeles in terms of its square miles. The island of Barbados is tiny. 1/3 the size of Los Angeles. 400,000 Africans were brought to Barbados to grow sugar, and most of them were killed in the process. The life expectancy of an African from the moment of arrival until his or her death was 5 years. So 400,000 Africans were brought to Barbados to create the public sphere in England and democracy in Europe. Of course, nobody thought about it that way, but I'm telling you this is the result of these processes, and it's important that you understand this, right? In a space 1/3 the size of the city of Los Angeles. And so and the same was true in Martinique and Guadeloupe. These processes continue their migration northward through the Caribbean, and they culminate on the island of Hispaniola, and especially in the French colony that occupies the western third of that island, which was called Saint-Domingue by the French. The French are very late. It's astounding what happened in Saint-Domingue. The French do not begin to plant sugar in Saint-Domingue in any important quantity until 1720. The early 1720s. By 1791, Saint-Domingue, the French colony, constitutes about 1/4 of all of France's external trade. That 1/3 of the island of Hispaniola by itself constitutes about all of France's external trade. This is the very era, we're talking about the 18th century, of France's grand ascension in terms of wealth and power in the world. And you cannot persuade me that the derivation of wealth on the scale that commodities like sugar especially, but also cocoa and coffee and tobacco were producing in places like Saint-Domingue for the French was not as instrumental to the transformation of French society as Barbados and Jamaica were to the transformation of English society. In 1791, the Africans of Saint-Domingue decide that they can't take it. They're not going to live this way anymore. They refuse to be subjugated any further. They reject the prison industrial labor camp system, and they rise up in revolt. And overnight, they burn all of the plantation houses in the northern part of the island where the majority of the sugar was grown, and the French, of course, fought back, and a revolution ensues which does not culminate, I'm getting ahead of myself in the story, until 1804. But I have to tell you what happens in the meantime. So 1791, the revolution begins. I've called them Africans deliberately. They are not Haitians yet. Haiti didn't exist yet. There was no country called Haiti yet. These Africans did not have a common language yet. If you only live 5 years from the time you arrive, you don't have time to form a common culture. And that was actually part of the design of the prison industrial camp system. Africans were deliberately brought from different parts of the continent and kept divided that way among themselves to prevent or to forestall revolt, to make it harder for them to cooperate with each other in revolt against their French masters, or in the case of the British or whoever else, their European masters. In 1791, nonetheless, the Africans rise up in revolt. They defeat the army of Napoleon. Africans who didn't have a common language, who didn't have weapons, defeat Napoleon's army. What happens next? It's the most extraordinary story. For the moment, France is chastened. The distances are of course great. You can't suddenly dispatch a new army to try to defeat the slaves who had freed themselves. But the Spanish occupied the other two-thirds of the island of Hispaniola, and the Spanish, having seen how wealthy the French had become in sugar, the eastern part of Hispaniola is not such good territory for sugar, by the way. It's Haiti, the part that became Haiti, had the right kind of climate and soils and mountains, to the best kind for producing sugar. Anyway, the Spanish occupying the eastern two-thirds of Hispaniola said, we're not going to let this go. The French have been defeated. We're going to take it over. We have an army in our part of Saint-Domingue. We're going to invade and subdue the slaves and take them over ourselves. The Africans in Saint-Domingue defeat the Spanish. So they have defeated the French. Now they defeat the Spanish. What happens next? The English are watching from Jamaica and from various other places, and they say, this is a godsend. Saint-Domingue is the richest island in the Caribbean. The French have been defeated. The Spanish couldn't take it. It's like it fell in our lap. The English send the largest flotilla in their history. Look it up, verify it, don't trust me. They send the largest flotilla in their history to try to capture Saint-Domingue, and the Africans defeat the English. I'm sorry, it's the British now. They defeat the British. So you have the three greatest powers of the imperial age defeated by the Africans of Saint-Domingue. You have the French, the Spanish, and the English, but the story's not over. The French tried a second time. And now the French send the largest flotilla in French history across the Atlantic under Napoleon to try to recapture Saint-Domingue. And the Africans defeat France a second time. In 1804, with the birth of a republic created by Africans who invent a new nationality and a new state, a new republic, a place called Haiti, we see for the first time the highest degree of enactment, in fact, the only time, up until that point in history, and for a long time to come, of the enactment of the most sacred principle of the Enlightenment, that all people are created equal, that no race should be taken to be superior to any other race. The Haitians institute this in their founding constitution, right from the first day of their republic. They write into the law that all people are equal, and that there shall be no slaves and no masters and no subjugated peoples. By the way, this meant rights for white people too. It was not just a nationalist thing that said, blacks are in charge now, we're going to treat white people the way white people treated us. They said, everyone shall be treated equally. We could talk another whole day about Haitian history. The New York Times newspaper where I used to work in the last 2-3 weeks has been filled with very impressive documentation about the way that the Western world and France especially responded to the liberation of Haitians, and how France tried to punish the Haitians financially for many decades afterwards by extorting Haitians in order to grant recognition and financial, trade relations with Haiti. But I want to shift our attention to the United States, to my country, in my conclusion. Up until this point, so we're talking about 1804, the birth of the Haitian Republic. Up until this point in the history of my country, the United States, was dominated by the states of the South, plantation societies, prison industrial labor camp societies, the great crops created by the landed gentry who ruled my country and who most Americans think of as great people, who we revere as the founding fathers. The crops that these planters, up until this point in our history, generated were mostly tobacco and rice, sometimes a dye called indigo. With the Haitian Revolution, the birth of Haiti, this plantocracy, these planters, these southern gentry leaders who dominate the early history of my country, take fright. They imagine being one of them. You live in Virginia or Georgia or South Carolina or one of these places, and black people are as numerous as white people, and in some localities, more numerous than white people. They have seen that Africans defeated the three great imperial powers of Europe and defeated France twice. And they say, listen, this is pretty dangerous. We can't have Africans concentrated in the eastern part of the United States like this anymore, because if they can defeat these great powers, they will also eventually rise up and defeat us. And that can't be tolerated. And so with the Haitian Revolution, you see the birth of American expansionism in a new way, with a new kind of fervor and urgency that takes place, and it is facilitated by the defeat of Napoleon a second time. By the way, most French people do not learn this history in school. More British soldiers were killed by the Africans who founded Haiti on the island of Hispaniola than were defeated in the American Revolution. If you go to British military museums, there are banners, there are flags for all of the great battles of the past, including the flags in which the British were defeated. Regimental flags honoring the dead. There are no regimental flags for the British who died in Haiti, because it's a shame to recognize that you were defeated by Africans. Africans defeated Great Britain, and Great Britain doesn't have the space in its public mind to acknowledge this. More people died in Haiti than died in the American Revolution among the British armies. So American expansion is greatly facilitated by the double defeat of Napoleon. Napoleon is nearly bankrupt by these two adventures. Napoleon has ambitions in Europe, notably, which are going to lead to catastrophe for Napoleon in trying to conquer Russia. And Napoleon decides that in order to avoid financial failure for his nation and to sustain his armies, he should sell his land holdings in the continental United States to the Americans. The Americans wanted to buy them because they wanted to redistribute the concentration of enslaved African peoples from the eastern coast westward into the interior of the country so as not to be overthrown by them. And Napoleon wanted to sell because Napoleon was desperate financially. This led to the famous Louisiana Purchase. The Thomas Jefferson administration buys all or part of 15 modern American states for, actually I believe the number is also $15 million. Sounds like a big number in 1804, but that is half of the size of the present-day continental United States, acquired overnight as a result of the defeat of the great imperial powers of Europe in Saint-Domingue by Africans. With the redistribution of enslaved peoples out of the Old South, the so-called Old South, Virginia, Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina, etc., they are sent into the Mississippi River Valley, where for the first time cotton becomes a major commodity in the United States. This begins, so I told you that France begins sugar production in Hispaniola in Saint-Domingue in 1721, thereabouts. Portugal begins sugar plantation on a large scale in Brazil in around the year 1570. Cotton takes off in the begins in the United States in 1791. In 1791, the United States was producing in total about 20 million pounds of cotton per year. By 1830, the United States was producing, I believe the figure is 30 million, so 20 million pounds that's wrong, excuse me, let me start over again. In 1791, the United States was producing 11,000 bales. I don't know how many kilos a bale is. It's an old-fashioned, antiquated measurement, but it's not a huge number. Only 11,000 bales of cotton. In 1830, the United States was producing about 30 million pounds of cotton. By 1865, the United States is producing the staggering sum of 2 billion pounds of cotton. All of this cotton is being produced by who? By enslaved Africans using the same institution that was invented in Sao Tome, the prison industrial labor camp system, and in the generation of a new kind of commodity bonanza, but this time not with sugar, with this new crop, cotton, which is the basis of the Industrial Revolution. So at this very time, England in the region of Lancashire is beginning to perfect the production in industrial ways of textiles, mass textiles for the very first time. And we think of this as the product, when I say we, I mean we, I include myself, we as Westerners. We think of this as a story of Western ingenuity. Westerners are great inventors. Westerners are great, period. We like to think of ourselves as great, right? It's a habit of mind, right? So Westerners are really clever, and they begin to organize the grouping together of looms under one roof, and then to have a manager who supervises the supply of this and of that, and the work shifts of the workers, and specialized roles for individuals, and all of this. This is told as a story of ingenuity. But there is no industrial revolution without the prison industrial labor camp system. There is no industrial revolution without those 2 billion pounds of cotton. All of those textiles were cotton, overwhelmingly from the Mississippi River Valley. And all of these processes flowed out of, first, the discovery of gold in Elmina, because Europe, nominally, the Portuguese thought West Africa was the most important part of the world to connect to. And then the discovery of an island, Sao Tome, unoccupied, where sugar grows almost miraculously. The invention of the prison industrial labor camp system and of the institution of chattel slavery, racialized transgenerational slavery. This transits the Atlantic, as I've told you, enters Brazil. Brazil then becomes fabulously wealthy for the Portuguese through the cultivation of sugar. It makes its way up the Caribbean, one island to the next, culminating in the revolution of Haiti. And Haiti places the United States on its path to becoming the richest country in the world and eventually the most powerful country of the world. All of this is an expression, directly or indirectly, of Africa and of Africans, and we don't know this. We have blocked it out of our minds. We have told this as a story of enlightened people who had grand, noble ideas about democracy and the Enlightenment, or about cleverness involving industrial organization and factory production and all the rest, and we have left out the very foundation, the things without which none of these developments would have happened, which is the expropriation of wealth and labor from the African continent. And so with that, I will stop and thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your conversation and questions.
Huge thank you to Professor French for that hugely significant lecture and your generosity in sharing your knowledge with us. I'd also like to extend a thank you from Mayor Philippe Close, who apologizes he had to leave early. So now we will continue with an interview and followed by a Q&A. So the interview will be led by Jonathan Holslag, who is himself the author of several internationally recognized books and is Professor of International Politics at VUB. So Jonathan Holslag, I invite you to come and sit here, and we will have this interview with Howard French.
Thank you.
I'm going to slip it on.
Okay. Thank you. I'm going to be brief so as to have a lot of time for the audience to interact with Howard. Howard, first of all, thanks a lot for having accepted the invitation. It's a great pleasure and an honor to have you, especially because of this book. I must say that I was one of these Europeans that also tended to take for granted that colonialism was a product of our mercantilism or industrial revolution. Whereas I think in this book you opened my eyes and made me also realize that a lot of our commercial success and our industrialization to a large degree, as you put it very eloquently, is or was born in blackness. Africa has always been a continent very close to my heart. Most of the people here in the room, I think, know me as an Asia hand. But actually, I started off my research in the east of Congo and Uganda about 17 years ago. And one of the things I saw there at that time was new comptoirs being set up. And a comptoir was kind of a walled compound where you had newly arrived foreigners from all parts of the world employing, hiring locals, Congolese people, male, essentially, to be with their feet in the mud again and to sort out the cobalt from the ore and the dirt. And at that moment I started asking myself a question that continued to nag me, and certainly even more after I read this: will Africa ever escape from this? So what you did, I think, very eloquently in the presentation was to look back. It's very important that we do that. I want to ask you three questions, just three questions that tempt you to look a bit forward. And let's take it back to this guy that is figuring very, very prominently on this excerpt from the Catalan map on the cover of your book, Mansa Musa. Mansa Musa was an autocratic leader in medieval Africa, if we can call it that way. But as you also point out and explain in the book, there were many Mansa Musas. There were many kings and people of the African nobility that pursued wealth, conquered, traded, pursued glory and prestige also in Africa and overseas. And as you write and formulate it in a question, in terms of a question, how was it possible that that elite of kings and nobility got to enslave their whole populace, the whole continent, in spite, as you put it, knowing that it's so detrimental? So we had that in the past, and then when I look at Africa today and I see the elite, and we see the capital flight that some of the students discuss with me in class, and we see the unequal deals again being negotiated and signed, how is it possible that we have African leaders still tolerating this to happen today? And what can African leadership and governance do in stopping, halting this unbalanced trade that has been going on for so long?
Thank you, Jonathan. And if I didn't say it or say it strongly enough at the beginning, I owe a special thank you to Jonathan Holslag for taking the initiative to invite me. The correspondence came from you, and I'm very pleased that this has brought us together and honored by your interest, and I want to express my gratitude that way. So you've asked two very different questions. One of them is looking back, the other one is contemporary and looking forward. With the looking back question, I don't completely accept the premise of the question. I don't think it is true that Mansa Musa enslaved everybody. I don't think that the Mali Empire, in fact, was a slave society. There have been, according to the traditional anthropological and political science definitions of the term slave society, in history there have been very few slave societies. Ancient Rome was a slave society.
Just to interrupt, the point was not so much that he was enslaving the people, but allowing others, and kings like Mansa Musa, not only him, to enslave African people. Why didn't they resist it more? And
well, so I'll come to that, but I don't want the audience to be left with the idea that Mansa Musa was a great slave lord. I don't think that that would be an accurate impression of Mansa Musa. So I think your question really is a version of a question that I hear almost every time I give a talk, and in fact I heard this morning in an interview. What was the name of the magazine? There's an interview. It's a Dutch name. I think
it's Knack, that interview.
That's correct. Yeah. So a very smart and well-intentioned journalist from Knack magazine asked me a version of the same question, which I hear all the time, which is, why did Africans sell people into slavery if they knew that it was not going to be good for Africa? How could that be? And why should we? I'm going to use an American idiom. I hope you will understand what I'm going to say. But why should we cut them any slack? Why should we forgive them for that crime? Why should we hold the Europeans to account for their history and not treat the Africans with every bit as much severity as we treat the Europeans? I think that it's very natural to be tempted to understand things according to that logic, but I think it's a faulty logic. I have had the great fortune to have worked, like you, for many years in Asia. I lived in China for 6 years as a correspondent. I've written several books about China. I've lived in Japan for 5 years. I have not written a book about Japan, but I know that country and its history and the history of the Koreas very well. Traveled all throughout Asia. I know most of the North and South America, as well as most of Africa, and in fact most of Europe. If you look carefully at history, the very notion of African as an identity, as a collective thing that might have a relevance in the political life of a people or of a society is a very recent development. Africanness as an idea doesn't really begin until the 19th century. So that might surprise you in the audience. Why didn't Africans think of themselves as Africans? Well, if you live in a world where everyone is African, there's nothing remarkable about being African. There's nothing to define yourself in distinction to. Yes, along the coast in many places, beginning in the 1400s and then accelerating through the succeeding centuries, more and more they came in contact with people who came from other parts of the world, and especially Europe, especially in search of slaves. But the overwhelming majority of the peoples of Africa never saw a European until the 19th century, ever saw a European. They didn't have an idea that they live in a place called Africa and that there's this thing called we're all Africans and we need to stick together because there's this thing called the Europeans and the Europeans are going to try to take us over and control us. They had no reason to think that way. And if I may go further, I would say this was also true of Asians. It was also true of Native Americans. Even though European imperialism was penetrating these other parts of the world, it was not until the 19th century that a synthetic view begins to take hold in Asia for the first time in history, that there's something called Asia, and that there's something that Asians, as it seems like a familiar term to us today, but it was not a familiar term prior to this in the 19th century, the idea that Asians have a common interest in understanding European imperialism as a threat to them. This begins in the 19th century, and it has a very slow road in the 19th century. The Japanese take the lead in this process, and the Japanese become seized with the danger that is presented to Asia by Europe, and the Japanese seek to speak to the Chinese about it. By the way, because my last book talks a lot about this question, I know the history very well. Other than the Japanese, the only really, it's funny, we don't think of these people today as Asians, but the only other peoples who we know of in the Pacific world who were really seized with the idea of Asianness in the beginning and of a threat from Europe were the Hawaiians. The king of Hawaii sent a delegation to China in the middle of the 19th century to tell the Chinese that we are all Asians and we better stick together, because if we don't stick together, the Europeans are going to take over all of Asia and we're all going to suffer. And the Chinese said, we don't know what you're talking about. We're all Asians. That's not true. We are Chinese, and we'll take care of ourselves. And so the Japanese, I'm not justifying acts of imperialism subsequently by Japan, but the Japanese, out of a kind of exasperation, begin to formulate an idea which leads to the events of the Second World War, in which the Japanese say, listen, the rest of the Asians just don't get it. We have to take the lead in doing this, and even if it means us colonizing all of Asia for the purpose of bringing Asians together to defeat the white people, we must do that. And this is the beginning of the Japanese, modern Japanese imperialism on the scale that we saw it. It is out of this very same idea. And so back to Africa now. Why did the Africans, I think I've answered part of the question, why did the Africans not understand that there was this big threat coming, heading straight for them? And
you don't refer to a threat, but you explain, for instance, in your chapter 8, if I'm not mistaken, that there was strong awareness in the African elite of the strength, the wealth of Europe, perhaps not the military threat. And again, you ask the question yourself, you put it, I think, literally like that in the book. Why didn't that elite push back against the unequal, unfair deals that started off with just trade and then trade in slavery? And then the question was rather, why don't we see today much more from Africa? An elite that pushes back actively, vigorously against these unfair deals instead of signing off on that. It's a question that I keep asking myself.
Sure, I haven't forgotten the second question of yours. I see these as very separate questions, and I understand the temptation to kind of draw a line linking the African elites of the past with the African elites of today, but I actually don't think that line exists. If there's no synthetic notion of Africa, then there's no particular reason to think that Africans in Cameroon and Africans in Mali would have thought of themselves as being a common people and having a need to join together. But why did the elites, that was your word and it's a well-chosen word, in various places collaborate with Europeans in the sale of human beings? There are some obvious reasons why. The elites of Africa in this period, not seeing themselves as having a common identity as African, were doing what elites seek to do across time everywhere. Their first priority, they may have some obligation to their own people, but their first priority is the enhancement of their own position. That's what elites do everywhere. That's the first instinct of, that's what it means to be an elite. It is to preserve your class interest, right? And so the class interests of these people in these moments of history we're talking about dominated. And what did it mean to dominate? It meant that they, by selling human beings into the transatlantic slave trade, these elites would have access to prestige goods. What were the prestige goods of the time? The prestige goods were fine cloth. The prestige goods were alcohol. The prestige goods were tobacco. The prestige goods, in some cases, were items of worked metal or jewelry, or the same sorts of things we always think of as luxury goods, right? And that this, by obtaining these sorts, and also of guns, and the guns were seen by these African elites mostly as being of ceremonial use and not of military use. And that's because European guns were not very good until the 19th century. They didn't have a very strong application in the field far away from the European continent. They couldn't be used in sufficient quantity with sufficient sufficient firepower to ensure a good outcome for a European army far afield from the continent, right? And so these elites were behaving in elite kind of ways, seeking to reinforce their own wealth and prestige through the acquisition of these goods. And I would say one more thing, and that is that, listen, I indeed make the argument that enslavement was bad for Africa, objectively bad for Africa, historically disastrous for Africa. My estimate is that probably around 30 million human beings were killed or extracted from Africa during an era where the peak population of the entire African continent, north to south, was 100 million people. Figurez-vous, 30 million out of 100 million people. That's an enormous hit to Africa, right? So I'm not making an argument that slavery was good about for Africa, or that, you know, the elites should have been complacent about Africa, but I do understand the difficulty of an elite person in Benin thinking that he had interest in common with an elite person, or even a means of communicating with an elite person in Guinea or an elite person in Congo, right? And at the same time, I would say that Africans, until the 19th century, with the arrival in Africa of Portuguese Africans, Brazilian Africans, so Afro-Brazilians, who got involved in the slave trade in a big way in the 19th century. This is the first time that Africans on the African continent of any kind had any possibility of understanding what was happening in the Western Hemisphere with chattel slavery, with the prison industrial labor camp system. So I'm not prettifying the fact that they were selling human beings, but they had no notion that these people were being put to work on plantations for the purpose of creating European wealth that would only come back to harm them further as Europe grew richer and stronger. They didn't know why the Europeans wanted their human beings. And the Europeans weren't telling them, of course.
For the sake of time, because I see that our host is getting a little nervous, I will ask one final question. I was very surprised to read that in the 17th century already we had a first occasion of African deindustrialization, if we can call it that way, that you point out. Africa had a juvenile textile manufacturing base, and that a flash flood of Dutch textile essentially destroyed that. Today we see something similar, and again, trying to take it a bit more to contemporary situation in the future. We see that Africa is being caught between what seems to be an economic rock and a hard place. Like on the one hand, you get a flash flood essentially of agricultural goods from the West, from Europe and the US, that makes life impossible to a lot of African farmers. On the other hand, you have a flash flood of industrial goods from China. Like, what would you advise? How do you think we should deal with that? If the past shouldn't again become too much a part of the future? It's again bringing us back to these unequal partnerships, unbalanced trade relationships.
Sure. I want to come back to the part of your previous question that I didn't respond to, which is contemporary African elites. Why aren't they held to account, or why aren't they to be blamed, at least in significant part, for the fate of Africa? They should be. They should be, by all means. And Africa is not going to change in terms of its political culture, except by the actions of Africans. No European, no American, no Chinese, no outsider is going to arrive in Africa and achieve some kind of revolution in terms of the thinking of Africans about the nature of the state, or of the relationship between the elite and society, or about the functionings of government. And in fact, this is one of the great ills of colonialism. The part of the colonial project was to say, here's how you should do things. And it was in the mold of Europe, of course, that Africans were told they should do things. I understand why Europeans thought that, but the illusion that outsiders could tell Africans how to live was just as false then as it is now. There's no such thing as somebody coming. Africa's not going to be saved, or in fact, reorganized by outsiders. It wouldn't happen then, and it's not going to happen now, and it won't happen in the future. Africa needs to have its own revolution, its own sursaut. Africans have to come to their own understanding of what kinds of institutions suit them best. How do they hold their leaders accountable? How do you achieve some kind of social equity and social justice, et cetera, et cetera? These are African problems, and they will have to be solved by Africans. To the economic part of your question, I want to say, and I think this was implicit in the question, the structure of the global economy is extremely unjust. It is extremely unfair. I've used the word structure deliberately. Africa is excluded from the global economy in structural ways. You have talked about agriculture, that's one piece of the picture, and industry is the other piece of the picture. This isn't necessarily because Europeans or Americans or Chinese people are evil. It's just in the course of things. Europeans and Americans and Chinese got there first and are powerful and rich and want to defend their own established interests. And they have the power to ensure the protection of their own interests. And so they have, through their own authority, been the primary movers in the creation of the structure of the international economy that we know, that we are familiar with. And Africa, having entered the modern era with the kind of weakness that we talked about through the details of my speech today, with this historical legacy of subjugation, of enslavement, losing 30 million people over the course of the slave trade, of being divided up into tiny little countries for the most part that don't follow any logic inherent to the needs of either local society or geography. African countries are paying a big legacy for this. The final piece, because I've also worked in China, as I've said, this problem of industrialization is an enormous problem, and it doesn't only affect Africa. It affects most of the so-called developing world. China was a very poor country until the late 1970s. China in the 1980s begins to industrialize and achieves industrialization on a scale that had been historically unimaginable up until that time. And because of the scale of Chinese industrialization, China has costs and advantages of scale that can't be matched by any following developing country. Even India, the largest of these countries, can't industrialize because China got there first and occupied this space on such a scale by historic accident of globalization and a friendliness among the Western countries, the rich countries, to outsourcing to a place like China where things could be done cheaply for the profit of Western corporations. China was lucky. It arrived there at the right moment with its opening, and it had a plan, and it took advantage of this. And nowhere in the rest of the world that had not already been industrialized is going to have an easy time industrializing. And the most difficult part of the world is Africa, which has these artificial balkanized countries with these huge historical handicaps that are the legacy of these 500 years of history that we've been talking about.
I will yield my final question and hand it back over to our host. I hope that we still have a lot of time left.
Yes, we're under some pressure to finish up here at 9 p.m., but we would really like to take some questions.
I'm sorry for being long in my answers. Yeah.
Well, we're here to listen to you speak. So if anybody has a question from the audience, I can bring the microphone over. Yes?
Thank you very much for your discourse. I am a historian myself from KU Leuven. We studied social economy and also American economic history, so I could follow very well what you're talking about. I'm been married to a lady from Nigeria also, so also that came alive for me, that part of the story. Now, last week on Tuesday, I was here in Brussels to listen to Karen Armstrong, the famous writer on world religions. And in a way, there is a connection between your two stories. She has just published a new book, in Dutch first, Heilige Natuur, Sacred Nature. And she thinks that people like scientists and even Greta Thunberg referring to scientists is not enough. The statistics, the ciphers, the numbers and so, to change the terrible threat of climate change and of destroying the nature and the species. And she believes that we, in a way, have to go back to the time before industrialization and recreate a natural awe and wonder towards nature. Do you think that is a good trace for scientists, for humanity?
Thank you very much for the question. So there are questions that exceed my own authority. I want to be the first to acknowledge, and this falls somewhat in that category. What I would say, as someone who has worked in China and who continues to write about China as well as sustaining an interest in Africa, is the rest of the world cannot follow the Western model. It's impossible. The world cannot arrive at a station where everyone has Western patterns of consumption and Western patterns of prosperity. This is a fundamental crisis in the world today that we don't acknowledge very often, right? Even China, which has made enormous leaps in terms of economic progress in the last 40 years or so, has not attained Western levels of wealth on a per capita basis. And if it does, let's forget Africa for the moment. If it does, that's probably going to destroy the world. Okay? So what do we do? What do we do? Do we say that it's okay for the West, the thing that I defined in the beginning of the talk, to live this way and for the rest of the world not to live that way? Or do we say that everyone has to adjust the way they live to some very significant extent, and that the concept of equity has to be involved in this? I don't have the answer to that question. I don't have a formula for you, but I think this is profoundly relevant to the future. And I think that there are no easy answers. So on the one hand, it's very tempting to say that industrialization is a dead end, but try deindustrializing and see how you like it. Deindustrialization may also be a dead end. And so back to my first part of my answer to you, I simply don't know. I recognize the crisis, but I don't have an answer.
Thank you.
Yes, good evening. I read your book and I found it really brilliant. And again, this evening, your lecture was great. And you're reformulating the traditional narrative that we know and challenging it. And I'm wondering what will be the reception of your book. Do you already notice some impact of what you have been writing? Like, take the case of Portugal and Spain. I think these are countries which are not really questioning their own past and their own colonial past. Do you see already some impact of your book on what people think about their own past?
Thank you so much for your question, and thank you for reading the book. There's nothing better for an author than to meet people who have read his book. So I appreciate that. I don't know what the reception of my book is going to be, and I don't know what the impact of my book is going to be. I didn't write the book with the illusion that I was going to change the world. I think much more modestly that if I can introduce ideas that become part of generative conversations that begin now and take on a life of their own, then that's a good contribution. Without thinking about where does this end up, or what's the final point of conclusion, right? I do know that in my own country, I have probably spoken already in the 7 months since my book came out at maybe 40 universities, 50 perhaps, and various other talks. And I do know that in the United States, in the university world, many people are reading my book. And many people will be using my book in courses, in classes. And so my book will be part of a kind of generational shift, I think, in terms of it won't be the only book that's used, or I won't be the only model for thinking of this history, but it will become part of, going forward, a reconsideration of global history. And I feel very good about that. I didn't know what to expect myself, and if what I imagine to be happening is true, that's fantastic. My book is being translated into many languages right now, including Spanish. There's a Spanish edition coming. Portuguese, there's a Portuguese edition coming. There's a Brazilian Portuguese also edition coming. There's a German edition coming. There are editions in other parts of the world, Japan, Korea, China, Taiwan. All of those have editions coming. Interestingly to me, there's not yet a French edition coming. I don't know what the reason for that is. I feel very bad about that. I think that France is as deeply implicated as any other country in this history, and it would please me very much to see it published in France. And so it's affecting change in its own small way like that as well. I should also say that, there are things that an author can't imagine. right, that can be very important. Someone reads my book and then wants to follow up. My book contains many, you've read it, many different stories from many different geographies crossing 600 years. And so somebody sees something in the book and they say, I never thought about this way or that way. I'm going to investigate this further and write something more focused on this particular moment or this particular geography or this particular political question. That's also a very good effect of a book like this. And debate is healthy. I don't presume to know everything or to have the only way of thinking about something. And so I feel very pleased so far with this kind of reception.
I believe we have time for just one more question. There was someone over here.
Thank you very much. First of all, thank you for the interesting lecture. I really enjoyed it. In the beginning of your lecture, you were speaking on the Portuguese sailors. You were speaking on Henry the Navigator. I was just wondering, you were talking about the economical part of it really much, but the historical narrative that we learn at school also pretty much puts a focus on the religious part of the sailing, of the navigations. I would wonder, how do you think about it? How do you think like the Portuguese try to embed the religion also in Africa and Asia? But more importantly also, when you talked about Columbus, famously indeed let us discover the gold, but also the religious part. So I was wondering, how do you see the religious part playing a part in all of that?
There are many things to be said on this question, and time is short, and so I have to be efficient. I would say, first of all, I was raised religiously. I am not a religious person in terms of practice any longer. But I was kind of astounded to be reminded through my research of how it shouldn't be surprising, right? If anyone has read books before, and I've read a lot of books, but I was nonetheless astounded by how powerful a force religion has been in the life of European societies and of European history throughout the time period that I'm discussing in my book. Just astounded, one thing after another. We treat Africans and other non-Western peoples as being primitive and superstitious in terms of their spiritual understanding of the world. But Portuguese and Spanish people, just to choose these two countries, which I focus on a lot in this book, were just as superstitious as any Africans. They didn't go into major battles in places like Congo or Angola without doing many different kinds of ritualistic things. We Westerners, we call that religion, and we think of it as being culture and sophistication, but it's just ritual. The Africans have rituals and Europeans have rituals, and I don't think there's any real legitimate basis to differentiate those things. So that's one level of an answer to you. How profoundly, not to offend anyone, but ritualistic, which is maybe a synonym for superstitious, Europeans have been in the past, right? So that's one thing. Another element of an answer to your question, and I'll stop with this, is that religion served many purposes for the Europeans in the imperial era. The first of them, beginning between the Spanish and the Portuguese, was a competition between them to achieve the sanction of the Vatican for their actions. In other words, the Vatican was extremely powerful. This is before the Protestant Reformation, and the Vatican was the spiritual authority for pretty much all of Europe. And the Portuguese and the Spaniards were competing for the legitimation by the Vatican. And so it was not mostly, although many of these explorers and adventurers were profoundly religious people individually, their actions collectively were not especially religious. Their actions collectively were expressions of geopolitical power in competition with each other, which saw the Vatican as a sanctioning agency. And so they went about Africa telling the Vatican that they were saving souls by converting them to Christianity, and that this was preventing Africans from either living, in the words of the Europeans, as quote-unquote savages, or being converted into Islam. And the Vatican loved that. And so the Portuguese and the Spanish, everywhere they went and captured human beings and sold them into slavery, on the plank of the ship leading them from the African coast to sea, there's some character with holy water making the sign of the cross on the forehead of a person who has just been put into chains and is being sent to die across the Atlantic to produce sugar for European diets. And a report is being made to the Vatican, we saved 20,000 souls. We saved 50,000 souls. We converted these people from savagery to enlightenment and preserved them from burning in hell, right? This was as much a geopolitical thing as it was a religious thing. And it's important, I think, to understand it in those terms.
Thank you so much, Howard French. I would really like to invite you all to give it a round of applause for your talk. Thank you so much. Thank you for the questions from the audience, and I apologize for the brevity of that. So I'd just now like to invite Pascal Smet, the Secretary of State of the Brussels Capital Region, to come and give closing remarks to the talk today. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to be brief because you said already so many things, but I just want to say a couple of words. First of all, ladies and gentlemen, I think we're living in very weird times, where trust is more important than truth. And trust is based on belief, and belief is rarely based on facts. And it's very dangerous, I think, in the times we are living, because in a democracy, you need shared knowledge, you need shared facts, and things like this are eroding in the world of today. And so it is so important that you still think, as an American, and that we all are here, and especially young people here, to listen what you are doing, what you have been doing in the past, that, Jonathan, you organized this, because I believe that it is very important to challenge knowledge. And that's exactly what universities should do, and academic world should do, confront the unknown, as we say, what science is doing, because science basically is confronting the unknown. But what other sciences are doing, the human science, should be confronting the known and trying to find out where we did it wrong, where we did it get wrong, and understand that history is very often a human construction, a construct of things, of we believed that things were, not necessarily the truth. And we think, and I think, that we should all be in a permanent pursuit, not only of happiness, which is very important in human life, but also in the pursuit of truth. And that can only be done by challenging the known, and it can only be done by thinking. And in these weird times where trust is more important than truth, it seems like thinking that's something we do no longer do, because you know that attention spans in the news, it's well, 30 seconds, 2 minutes. If we try to explain something on television and we go further than 30 seconds, we are cut off. It's TikTok all today, small movies, and people tend to go very fast in their thinking, and the simplification of everything makes it, in a way, interesting times. And that reminds me to something, I know some of you might have seen that. I went to the Biennale of Venice, you know, every 2 years, and the theme a couple of years ago was, may you live in interesting times. And which is very special, because everybody thinks it's an old Chinese verb, a kind of curse, actually, because they were said bad things will happen to you. Well, it seems that it's not a Chinese verb, that is a European invention, or of Chamberlain, I believe, in the beginning of the 19th century, that he say, may you live in interesting times. And I think we're living in interesting times today, like every human being in every generation was living in interesting times, because we always try to think that we are living in special times. There's always for people, and in some way, history is repeating it. And so I think it is important that evenings like this, that people don't walk on the streets, but just come together and listen to someone with so much not only experience, but trying to find knowledge and trying to report on things what happen in the world, and not only making news, because I think that's one of the biggest mistakes that journalists are doing today too, making news instead of reporting what is happening. So thank you for coming to Brussels, all the way from New York, and thank you for the VEB, and Jonathan, you too, for the initiative. When he came to us, to the mayor here, to me, and he said, I want to put Brussels on the world map Of course, Brussels is already on the world map. Yeah, he said that. There's his way of saying, give me some money. Actually, it was like that. But it's not my money, it's taxpayers' money. Politicians should never forget that we have a part of distributing taxpayer money, but we can choose to whom we will give the money and to which initiatives. And we immediately believed it because I think Brussels deserves it to be on the world map. We are, after all, the first diverse city in Europe, the second in the world. But also, there's a lot of things going on. We are diplomatic center of the world. So knowledge is needed in this city, in this part of the world. And so all of you who are young and the ones who are lesser young, may you live in interesting times and never forget you can make times. I think that you can make it. It's not something, history doesn't happen like that. We are not undergoing it. It's human made. We are making it. So make it, do it in a better way, and find happiness and never believe, and maybe answering a question that you didn't ask, I think, respond. I think human greed should never be underestimated as a reason why some things happen, and why in Africa it happened and still is happening today, is very basically human greed. And that is combined on the other side of humans, the kind of finding fairness. So the combination of the one hand, greed and fairness gives a kind of battle, and it's an ever-going battle, I guess, as long as humanity will exist. So thank you for being here. Thank you for the initiative, and looking forward to the next editions. And I will be in New York next week, so I'm very happy to see the other side of the world. So thank you again for being here in the most beautiful place of the city, on the most beautiful square. And if you stay along for the reception, you will see the square enlightened at night like a beacon, not in a dark world, but in a world in search of happiness. So thank you.
Yes, thank you very much again to Howard French and to Jonathan Holslag. And this lecture series is sponsored by the City of Brussels and the Capital Region of Brussels. And on that note, we invite you all to join for a reception after the talk to continue the conversation. Thank you.